Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen, Executive Director of the Government Accountability Project. In just a few minutes, a conversation with a woman whose own experience blowing the whistle has led her on a lifelong mission to assist others who put at risk their careers and reputations to do the right thing. But first, the economic meltdown has brought into sharp relief just how complex and fragile the global web of financial markets really is, and how governments have lacked either the will or capacity to effectively regulate these markets. One seeming no-brainer would be to incentivize insiders in financial institutions to blow the whistle on wrongdoing. But is that what we're doing? Let's learn more from Jack Blum, a money laundering expert and the chair of the Tax Justice Network, and Jesselyn Radack, Homeland Security Director of the Government Accountability Project. Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. Jack, let's start with you. You've been tracking international money flows for a long time now. Is there a regulatory mechanism that effectively tracks private capital flow around the world?
There isn't really. You can get information from individual governments when they provide it, if they provide it, and there are numbers of governments that very carefully omit providing significant information.
But the idea of the rich parking their excess money in tax havens is nothing new, is it?
It's been going on for a long time. What's new is how easy it became because of the web and because of the extraordinary sales efforts of large numbers of international financial institutions.
Describe the machinations of somebody who's trying to secrete money somewhere in some offshore or tax haven location.
It typically doesn't require a lot of machination by the individual. There are salespeople for these different banks, some of them, as we know from the UBS case, who ply the U.S. Rather vigorously looking for customers. And once they find a customer, they set up all the necessary machinery to move the money out of the country and hide it offshore. UBS got caught, and we saw the machinery in operation. They held these events, yacht races, art festivals, and they would bring their salesmen there to connect with very rich people.
UBS being a Swiss bank, and they recently struck a deal, Jess, with the IRS and Justice Department, is that right, regarding turning over the names of American depositors in the bank. These Swiss banks like UBS have anonymous numbered bank accounts typically. Is that a good deal?
I wouldn't call that plea any sort of bargain. I think in the criminal case, they paid a $780 million penalty, which is really underfined compared to how much ill-gotten gains they received during the course of this. And in terms of the names, settling for 4,500 names when you originally thought 52,000, I don't think settling for fewer than 10% is a good deal.
And the idea was that simply by settling for the 4,500 names, but they were unknown to those depositors, that others would come forward because they didn't want to get caught not coming forward.
Right. There was a tax amnesty program set up, and it was really interesting that the Justice Department would actually use that word, amnesty program, to try to get people to self-report. And a number of people did come forward, but it was Russian roulette in terms of people who had offshore Swiss bank accounts on whether or not to disclose. So of the 52,000 minus how many ever came forward, somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000, that many people are still running around with no penalty or consequence whatsoever.
And do we have any idea how much money is involved in these 52,000 accounts?
Yes, in the hearings, UBS itself said we were talking about $20 billion in assets on which they were earning fees of $200 million a year. And the irony of all of this is, yes, they made more money over the number of years involved than they paid in fines. So they were net ahead on having run this business. The further irony is the amnesty was so set up so that it only looked back 6 years, so that if some of these customers had been doing it for 20 years and had never paid tax on the money originally earned that went into the account, they came out net ahead after paying penalties, interest, and taxes on the past 6 years.
Just what led the IRS to UBS?
Well, according to both the IRS and the Justice Department, a whistleblower named Bradley Birkenfeld, who had been a UBS banker, was the entire reason they had any case whatsoever against UBS. He had been a banker with UBS for about 4 or 5 years. He complained internally through UBS's whistleblower policy about the problems, and they did a sham investigation, and he then came forward voluntarily to various different federal agencies, including both Congress, Justice Department, IRS, and SEC.
Now, he isn't somebody with clean hands himself, is he? He acknowledges smuggling diamonds in toothpaste tubes across the ocean on behalf of clients. So shouldn't he pay a price?
Yeah, he pled guilty to 1 count of fraud conspiracy and has been paying a price on home arrest for the past 1.5 years. For unknown reasons, the Justice Department delayed his sentencing 4 times, and even once sentenced, delayed it again because they wanted his further cooperation, although he's reached out and they haven't wanted to speak with him.
And so what about the other people who were involved in this scheme at UBS?
As far as I can tell, everyone has gone scot-free. Martin Lischke, who was a UBS kingpin, is back in Switzerland. He was actually here in U.S. detention for 4 months, pled the Fifth in front of the Senate, and then was released back to Switzerland. His boss, Raoul Weil, I believe has been convicted or at least indicted and is a fugitive from justice back in Switzerland or Liechtenstein. All the other major players at UBS have suffered no consequence. Because of the settlement you mentioned earlier, the bank itself has avoided criminal liability. And so far, in terms of UBS clients who have been sentenced, nobody has been sentenced to jail but for the whistleblower, Bradley Birkenfeld, who's an American.
Now, the really surprising part of this story is that while all of this was going on, the Federal Reserve bailed out UBS. UBS was in the hole $86 billion on bad dealing in U.S. mortgage-backed securities. UBS went to the Swiss National Bank and said, unless we get a big pile of money, in this case, I think it was about $50 billion or more, we're out of business. The Swiss then came to the Fed and said, we need dollars to take care of UBS's problem. And the Fed said, no problem, we'll give you a swap line, unlimited, at the current exchange rate. And that bailed out UBS. No conditions, no turnover of 52,000 names. It's here we are, one central bank to another. At the minimum, they should have said 52,000 names or you guys can go to the dustbin of banking history.
The whistleblower suit that Birkenfeld would like to prevail under is related to the IRS, Jess. Tell me about this law and how does it work?
It's not actually a suit that he's brought. The IRS passed a law in 2006 to incentivize whistleblowers to come forward, and it functions much like a parallel qui tam law, in which it provides a reward of any proceeds the government reaps as a result of the information the whistleblower brought forward. So when Birkenfeld first started talking with the U.S., he filled out the one-page Form 211, I believe, claiming himself to be a whistleblower under the IRS program. Recently, he retained new counsel. He wasn't represented on that issue, and he has now filed or supplemented his original claim with a new filing. I mean, he's been sentenced to more than 3 years in jail, so it seems he should at least get the reward, which would be a portion of the $780 million that the U.S. has recouped.
Has this IRS provision been used before?
I don't know if other people have filed applications, but since the office went into effect in 2006, it has never paid out an award.
And Jack, what do you think the effect of the decision of prosecuting only, in jailing only Bradley Birkenfeld will be on the incentives to come forward?
Well, this is a serious question from this perspective. I don't object to the jailing of Birkenfeld because clearly he was in this business for quite a while before he found the conscience, and he handled a lot of money for a lot of rich people, and as you said, smuggled diamonds, which is a pretty good index that he wasn't exactly one of nature's noblemen. On the other hand, a number of the people who were caught in the UBS case for not paying taxes have gotten off with home sentences and rather light touch treatment. And the question really is, should they? These are people who, in my judgment, deserve much harsher sentences. There's a second issue, and that's on the whistleblower money. Congress passed the law, but IRS put it in charge of an office in Buffalo, New York, that has been run by lower-level civil servants who seem terrified at the thought of actually rewarding people who have given up information. So in at least two other cases that I'm involved in, where there's no question of criminal behavior in the United States on the part of the person who blew the whistle, they still haven't come up with the money, even though they've collected tens of millions.
And so what needs to be done legislatively to fix this?
The law is there. It's what needs to be done by Congress to kick the mule and make it do what the law says.
So it's a problem in how the IRS is running the office, and Congress needs more oversight of that?
Congress needs much more oversight. They need to really ask some hard questions. Among other things, in the proposed regs on the office, they're saying that if any of the materials that were used in informing IRS were obtained illegally, they won't pay the reward. So the question then becomes, how do you give information about an individual or employer who has violated the tax law without violating some other law? And that question hasn't been answered. And they're still struggling with it. So in other words, if I take payroll records that show somebody's cheating on tax, and my employer says those records were stolen, does that mean no reward? And if they assume that, it'll mean nobody ever collects.
Well, I wanted to respond to something Jack said. I have met Bradley Birkenfeld, and I do find him to be of strong moral character. He came forward. He's the only one who came forward. The DOJ actually had, the Department of Justice had Martin Liechty in its clause back in 2005 and didn't make a case. And Birkenfeld, it wasn't like he sat around doing this for years, reaping the benefits. I mean, he blew the whistle when he found a document on UBS's computers that contradicted what they were being trained and incentivized to do. And he blew the whistle internally immediately. And you have to keep in mind that what he was doing in Switzerland is legal. But to the extent that UBS set up a program in the Americas, ranging from Canada all the way down to Argentina, and started doing this, that was what the problem was. And Birkenfeld found something, an internal UBS document that conflicted with what he was being told to do.
And what was the conflict?
The conflict was in terms of actually how he should go about and how much to recruit, some of what Jack was talking about earlier, recruiting clients.
So are we okay then with the state of the law? Is the law itself generally okay in terms of chasing after tax havens and money launderers and people parking their excess revenues to hide from taxes, Jack?
I think the problem is enforcement tools, and where we go from here. The office that provides the rewards has to be cleaned up, but then IRS needs more manpower, more trained people, and a greater capacity to really go after the people who've been cheating who they find out about.
I agree. I think the law is a good one, but the way it's being played out right now, it ends up serving kind of as a perverse tool of entrapment, because unlike usual whistleblower protection laws, this is actually a whistleblower incentive law that encourages and ropes people into coming forward. And then to turn around and slam them and send them to prison sends a really chilling message. And I've already had other potential financial whistleblower clients on the offshore tax haven issue who have not gone forward because they see what happened to Bradley Birkenfeld.
Well, many thanks to GAP's Jesselyn Radack and Tax Justice Network's Jack Blum for helping us better understand the complexities of the global financial system and how we might better regulate and enforce that system for the common good. When we return, how Billie Garde turned her misfortune as a whistleblower into a career of helping others. Welcome back to Whistle Where You Work. The experience of whistleblowing is often searing for the individual who bears this cross. One's career, reputation, even one's family is put at risk just to do the right thing. Billie Garde is a whistleblower survivor who successfully turned lemons into lemonade, not only gaining a measure of justice for herself, but making a career of helping others who have the courage to stand up to wrongdoing. Today, she's a principal at the employment law firm of Clifford & Garde. Welcome to Whistle Where You Work.
Thank you.
You went to work for the Census Bureau. When was that?
It was the 1980 census.
And what were you doing there?
I was the assistant director of the Eastern Oklahoma office of the Census Bureau, which is a part of the Department of Commerce.
So you observed some pretty untoward behavior there, huh?
Almost immediately, I became convinced by what I observed that the man that I was working for, the director of the Eastern Oklahoma Census Office, was engaged in not only wrongdoing but criminal activity.
How so?
Well, we had people on the payroll that didn't exist. We had a friends and family payroll where we were paying people who were not coming to work. He eventually was taking bids to sell census data to the highest bidder. He was engaging in pretty serious sexual harassment of employees who went to work at the Census Bureau, pretty blatant sexual harassment, including kind of directing some of the young women to provide sexual favors to visiting campaign officials that came through Eastern Oklahoma.
And did you seek any help with this?
Yes. Initially, I tried to get him to stop what I thought was kind of first a joke and then maybe some bad judgment, and then it was clear that it was a pattern of deliberate behavior. And I sought help, I think, as most whistleblowers do, by going up the chain of command, eventually contacting the regional director of the Census Bureau in the Denver offices.
And what happened after you reached out?
Well, I thought it was a good thing. The director personally came down to the office in Oklahoma to begin an investigation, and I believed that the investigation would substantiate the concerns and action would be taken. That's not what happened. A few days after he arrived to investigate, he left, and when I came into work one day, my boss was standing by the door and had copies of statements that I had taken of other employees about what they had observed and what they had been asked to do. And he waved those statements in my face and said, I know what you've done or you're trying to do, and you're never going to get away with it. And proceeded to berate me for maybe an hour or so, and ended up that session by saying that he had enough local political clout to see to it that I would lose custody of my children.
Wow. And did you continue to work there after that?
I did for a little while. The retaliation was pretty immediate. Disconnected the phones, moved our offices, pretty much terminated any of my ability to do any substantive work. And about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months later, I was fired.
And after you were fired, did the harassment stop?
No, after I was fired, things continued to deteriorate for the people that worked there. And some of those workers, to this day I don't even know who, but some of those workers went to the newspaper to tell the newspaper what was going on, and also gave the reporter my name and said that if they wanted to substantiate what they had experienced and witnessed, that the paper should get a hold of me. By this time I was fired. I actually had traveled to Washington, D.C., and was attempting to meet with the new Inspector General of the Commerce Department about the concerns that I had developed. And the reporter tracked me down in D.C., and I talked to him, not anonymously. He actually had contacted me, but certainly off the record, and asked that my name not be used in any stories that they wrote. The story broke a couple of days later. It did not contain my name. It did not contain my name actually for a couple of weeks after that, before it was disclosed that I had also contacted him. But the retaliation against me was immediate. The same day that the story broke.
So was it evident to your former employer?
Oh, yes.
That it was you who was the source
absolutely.
of this?
Yeah. How do I know that? Because ultimately this was all investigated and ultimately ended up in front of a grand jury. But what happened was that my boss picked up my ex-husband, went down to the courthouse. The judge got off the bench, came into the hallway. My ex-husband did not say a single word. My boss said, "This is the ex-husband of the woman who's causing us all these troubles." Remember, at that point, my name was not in the paper. And the judge signed an order switching custody of my children. I had two small daughters, 5 and 6 at the time, and they subsequently essentially disappeared.
Wow. And so what did you do then?
I think in retrospect, with age, I think I had a mini nervous breakdown. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, I found the Government Accountability Project. After going through about 12 public interest groups who said they couldn't help me, Louis Clark listened to my whole story and really put it in context for me for the first time, which is, you're a whistleblower, and this is the kind of thing that happens to whistleblowers. And until he actually said that, I didn't really understand that that's what had happened to me.
And did you ultimately regain custody of your children?
It's a long story, longer than we have on this show, but it ultimately, through GAP's help and the help of a lot of lawyers who pitched in on my case without recompense, certainly in the beginning, I did get my children back. It got all the way to President Reagan, who was elected, and this came to his attention through a press conference that GAP held, and ultimately that was seen by the Secretary of Commerce, came to the attention of President Reagan through Jack Anderson's investigative reporting column, and a grand jury was convened in Eastern Oklahoma. My boss and I believe 7 of his top executives were indicted, and I got my children back.
So looking back on this, if you had to do it all again, if you had gone back to the census in Oklahoma today, and you knew what would have happened to you, would you have done it again?
Well, that's a tough question, because it ended up impacting 2 completely innocent little girls. They didn't sign up to take on the government in a corruption case. So with that in mind, no, I don't think I would have. That said, having now represented whistleblowers, working with Gov't for decades, now I'm a lot smarter, and I both understand and give advice to people about being smart about how you reveal things that are wrong. One thing I would have done is I wouldn't have said anything until I had my children back in my hands, given that threat was out there, even though to me it seemed completely unrealistic. And second, I would have been a lot smarter about working with an organization that knew the ropes before I bungled into this myself. I couldn't have gotten out of this myself. I now know there's resources, and everybody should know there are now resources to help people do the right thing without costing or paying the kind of cost with your career, your personal life it did for me.
You went to law school after all.
I did.
And after you graduated law school, you, and even during law school, you continued to work on behalf of whistleblowers, and you've actually taken this in a kind of new direction where you're not only working directly with whistleblowers, but you're attempting to improve the climate at companies.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I did go to law school, and I went to law school to specialize in representing workers who find themselves in these types of positions in order to avoid what happened to them, what happened to me. Along the way, I learned that, or I came to believe that for the most part, companies are not bent on destroying an individual who's trying to do the right thing. But the natural human instinct within a corporation and with individuals is to retaliate against someone who goes against the grain. And with education and advice and good judgment, many companies can be taught how wrong it is to allow retaliation to permeate their work environment and what the cost of that is. And I have seen some companies do a very good job. I will say, however, that it's a continual series of improvement of opportunities because the natural reaction of people and companies is to silence people who criticize them.
Well, many thanks to Billie Garde for your courage in standing up for yourself, and as importantly, for helping others who stand up for the public interest. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Whistle Where You Work.